Western blotting, a very important technique that is used for detecting proteins. All right. The first part of a Western blot is to do one of two things. One option is an SDS page. The other option is a native page. The much more common of these two to use in a Western blot process is the SDS page. The first thing that you have to do is you have to separate your proteins. And here what we have is an example of that protein separation. We've got our molecular weight ladder, and then we've got our samples 1, 2, and 3. So we separate our proteins through some sort of polyacrylamide gel electrophoresis technique. The next part is our proteins. Once they are present in our gel, what we have to do is we have to transfer them from our polyacrylamide gel into this membrane right here. This is a PVDF, if I remember correctly, is polyvinyl difluoride, and that is a material that can have proteins adhere to them. How are we doing this transferring? Well, just as we got our proteins to migrate through our gel, we're going to apply an electric field and transfer our proteins from our gel onto this PVDF membrane. Okay, so this is done in a solution using an electric current. Now, once we've transferred our proteins onto this membrane, we basically have them where we want them. What we will do in SDS page is we stain a gel with a coloring agent like Kumasi blue. Now, our staining here is going to be different. Our staining in a Western blot utilizes antibodies. Okay, now this right here at the bottom of our page is our PVDF membrane, which our protein is adhering to. The primary antibody is going to detect our immobilized protein on our PVDF membrane. The secondary antibody is really the one that gives us an answer. The secondary antibody is going to detect our primary antibody, okay? But our secondary antibody has an enzyme that will take on a substrate and catalyze a reaction to produce a signal. That signal is our visual cue that we can use to say whether or not our protein is present. So when you think about a Western blot, we've actually got a couple of ways to think about it. One way is a Western blot a direct method for telling whether or not an enzyme or a protein is present? It's going to be an indirect way, because what you're actually seeing, indirect, is you are seeing a signal from an enzyme. Okay, now there's another way that you can do a Western blot where you have a primary antibody that has an enzyme affixed to it. Is that a direct or an indirect method? I would argue that that is still an indirect method because of the fact that, well, you're watching the signal. The signal is coming from the enzyme, wherever that enzyme is stuck. Now, obviously, you can do this more and more times and develop this technique and get better at it and say, well, if my antibody, I know that my antibody is a very high quality. If my antibody is present, then I know that the protein is present, and therefore I have confidence in this technique. There's no question about that. But instead, what you need to focus on is the fact that your signal is not coming from your immobilized protein. Your signal is coming from an enzyme that is affixed to an antibody that is bound to your protein. So it's a little bit confusing there, but I would argue that a Western blot is still going to be an indirect technique. It's not to say it's a bad technique, it's a great technique, a very valuable technique, but that's kind of where it's going. Now, this signal is going to be detected. It could be through radioactivity, or it can produce a small amount of light, which is detected through a light box and a specialized piece of instrumentation. But your result would look something like this. This robust band in all of these wells right here, maybe even these down here, those are indicators that, yes, indeed, there is protein present. Again, this is indirect because you can say, well, my protein's present there because I have a signal there. And maybe the better way to look at it would be, I have a signal there, therefore I have my secondary AB antibody. And if my secondary antibody is there, I have my primary AB. If my primary antibody is there, then I know that my protein is there. So that's basically the process of visualizing a Western blot. And so Western blotting is a very powerful technique, and it's based on whether or not an antibody detects a protein and whether or not a signal is present. All right, well, I hope this was helpful.